This show is brought to you by Sparkade, our ADHD game-based learning platform that helps kids transform challenges into opportunities. Parents and educators, join the waitlist at play.sparkade.app/waitlist and be among the first to experience Sparkade when we launch. That is play.sparkade.app. You've landed at Spark Launch, the guide star for embracing what it means to be neurodiverse. I'm Mike Cornell, joined by CEO of Spark Launch, Chaya. Here, we navigate mental health triumphs and tribulations from all across the spectrum, charting a course through the shared experiences that unite us, and discovering how to embody the unique strengths within neurodivergent and neurotypical alike, igniting your spark and launching it into a better tomorrow. Hello there, I'm Mike.
I'm Chaya.
And today we're joined by Diana Stelin, an award-winning educator, artist, and founder of the Plein-Air Art Academy. Diana combines formal education from Cornell and Boston University with an innovative approach to art and emotional healing, developing the Spark method, which helps individuals and teams unlock creativity while managing burnout and emotional growth. A TEDx speaker and accomplished artist whose work has been featured at prestigious venues, Diana's approach to creativity and wellness has made significant impacts in personal transformations. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's amazing to be here.
Diana, when I first heard you speak on creativity and the energies and the flow and art and education, you really connected with my inner spirit. And I knew I had to have you on the show. So thank you so much for coming here and sharing your wisdom and your journey. And we want to dig right in. So why don't you share, the connection between education and art? What has art taught you in your life? And what is it that you want to share with others?
I think the main idea, and when I was prepping for the TED Talk, that was really the crux of it. You really had to come up with that one idea that is worth sharing. And a lot of people tend to think that creativity is only available to kids who are artsy and who have a natural talent, and that it's really all about creating pretty imagery. And it goes, in fact, so much deeper than that. Art really is about healing and about being that outlet through which we can process so much, regardless of how much experience you've had with art making in the past. It really is accessible to all. And through accessing art, we are actually accessing our inner selves, and we are getting in touch with our intuition, which we tend to do so rarely in our daily lives. And it is just so important, especially today when everybody is struggling with burnout and overwhelm and just all kinds of issues for all the different audiences, from teens to kids to adults in the workforce, adults outside the workforce, just everyone can benefit.
Yeah, you brought about an important point that every single person has that creativity in them, and it's not judged by what they produce. We have that creative force, that energy inside of us. And also, I think it depends on what kind of an art teacher you had in your childhood, because I've had people come and tell me that my art teacher criticized me, not critique. I mean, there's good kind of critiquing and the kind that shuts you off. Somebody was criticized so badly that they stopped painting. And that hurt me so much, just listening to that they had given that power to that teacher instead of owning up to their own creativity.
It happens to so many people, getting their wings cut off in second or third grade. That is probably the number one thing that people say to me when they enter a workshop is, I haven't done art since elementary school. And I'm pretty sure that the reason why for a lot of people is that particular incident that they can think back to, where there was some friendly adult who said, oh, are you sure that you can call this art, you know? And it is so devastating how much we are shaped by what somebody tells us at a very important age, where we're all starting to kind of look at who we are and how we're going to present ourselves in the world. I just went to this amazing live podcast by Jay Shetty where Mel Robbins joined in, and they talked a lot about how we're not born to self-criticize. We are born kind of to be, you know, being open to the world, being open to opportunities and everything that comes our way. And it's at that age of around 8 or 9 that culture starts to show us and judge us in terms of what the output that we're creating. And that's when we begin to shut down and begin to start judging ourselves more and more, because someone like that, like your wonderful teacher, said something awful about what you created because of their own insecurities, but we're too young to really understand that at that point. So we internalize it, and then we lose that huge part of ourselves.
Yeah, especially if you're a child that age, 8 to 9, everybody who's older automatically gets more power than you because they're older and they're telling you so. And that's how the world treats someone older, right? Listen to your parents, listen to your teachers. And so it all depends on what type of parent or teacher or adult that was around you. And especially if you're a neurodivergent child, a lot of neurodivergents are artists. They might not know they're artists, but they are. And in fact, everybody, even if you're not neurodivergent, you're an artist, has automatically believed them, trusted them, and agreed that you have to draw within the lines and color a certain way. And so yeah, it's all about reclaiming that power and then healing. So how is that healing journey? And I'm thinking that's your role, the healer, through art, through creativity.
Yeah, it's funny because now that you're talking about the power that we give away to adults, I was just thinking of a couple of scenarios with my own children and the children that I teach, where I've had my middle child who has classic ADHD come home and say multiple times that he was punished for doodling in the corners during his math class. And I mentioned that during my art classes, and all of a sudden, all these hands went up saying, yes, this happened to me too. This happened to me too. All of my teachers are constantly criticizing me for doodling on the sides of my pages. And that is their way to listen and learn. That's their way of processing information. And what the teachers are doing is this huge disservice because they're just taking information in differently. And it's not right.
Especially, if you look at the teacher is saying, you're not paying attention to me, and hence I'm punishing you. So it's all about that me, the ego, right, of the person. Instead, if they recognize that there is a possibility that the child could actually be listening and can listen more when they're not having that eye contact. And when they're looking elsewhere, they're taking in. So it's just a matter of understanding the child better and letting go of that ego that we all hold. That's our journey to become purer and purer. We still need our ego for our name and a body, for our presence on this planet, but nothing more than that. And so, to allow that child to create. So, talk about that healing process with adults and what your role is.
Yeah, it's amazing that you brought up the ego, because part of the SPARK method that I use for getting into flow with my participants, especially during the adult workshops and the corporate workshops that I lead, is that it starts with the letter S, which is staying present. And we go through about a 5-minute grounding exercise, which is part meditation, part visualization. And one of the things that I say to them is, when they do a body scan and kind of release any subconscious tension that they may be holding, I really want them to also open up their heart so that whatever comes through for them during the art making practice really comes from their heart. And I think that is that element of where you release your ego and you really touch base with your soul and what your soul wants to say and what the mood is for you today. And it could be something sad or angry or even violent, but as long as you use an outlet like creativity to release your emotions, you're going to be so much better off at the end. And then at the very end, so in terms of the letters that we go through, S is that staying present element, and that's the meditation and the visualization exercise. And we also do some breathing that really tones down our heart rate variability, which is very important in terms of balancing your nervous system. So all of that kind of backed with science in terms of really getting people to feel grounded in the particular space that they're in and in their particular mood. Then we move into letter P, which is paying attention. And once again, they're paying attention to where they are in terms of their emotional state, but they're also paying attention to the composition of the piece. And that's where it kind of gets into the actual process of art making and some basic techniques. Letter A is incredibly important, probably the most important element of this. And it is allowing themselves to play because, and I really tell everybody, especially when someone comes in, which always happens, with at least one or two or maybe even 5 participants, the very first thing that they say to me is, I don't have a creative bone in my body. I don't know how I'm going to do this. And the very first thing I say to them is, imagine that you're 4 years old again and that you just learned how to make basic shapes. And that's really all you need to get started. And that phrase is almost like permission for them to be little kids again and to just do whatever comes through for them. And it's so incredible to watch because once we go through a couple of techniques, whether it's oil pastels or watercolors or clay, about 20 minutes into the workshops, you can see the physical changes in people's faces. They're so much more animated and so much more open and talkative with whoever is next to them. And they really look like the little kids who are playing and experimenting and finger painting if they want to, and just playing with colors and mixing and just going for it. The next step is incredibly difficult when it gets to the end, and that is the letter R, which is releasing the end result. Because when it gets to the end, that's when that critic wakes up and starts to think about, well, what is my neighbor going to say about my final result? And how am I going to be judged by this whole group? And they need to know ahead of time that it is so much more about the process than it is about the end result, because we are so trained to focus on our goals and to set certain goals and to achieve those. So even those people who 20 minutes ago said that they haven't done art since elementary school, all of a sudden have such unrealistic expectations of what they are meant to achieve in this, 1 hour or an hour and a half class. And the final element of these workshops, which I think is probably the most important, is the letter K, and being kind to ourselves. So we do a little check-in or closing circle where I do not allow people to say anything negative about their piece. I want everyone to talk about where they succeeded and where they had fun. And then everyone else in the group pitches in with where they think that person succeeded. And then the whole experience ends on this really incredible transformational note where all of a sudden they're having aha moments and insights about the process that they just went through with kind of making mistakes and having happy accidents and coming out of things and learning something. And they also see that. And I also started to mention that halfway through the workshop. So it's not a huge surprise, but typically what people are challenged with during this workshop in terms of learning skills and trusting themselves is usually a mirror of what they might be struggling with in real life. And even for me, every single painting session that I have is a new insight, is a new breakthrough, and is a new perspective to kind of look at where I need to be progressing myself.
I think when people become kind to themselves, they automatically become kind to others.
Yes.
So it's a beautiful outlet that you have where people can truly find who they are, because it is an inner journey. Creativity is all about connecting to that inside, and beauty eventually comes out. And even as an artist, I've seen this. I've ripped so many canvases before I came out with a painting that somebody actually paid money for it. So just stay through the process, and one day you will be in love with your work. I feel that is the ultimate, where you love your work. It doesn't matter if it sells or what happens to it, but to be in love with yourself is the ultimate goal, and create from there.
And it's probably a lifelong goal, right? Because it's an iterative process, just like art making is an iterative process. And just today, I felt like I had to have a painting session before we record this, just to see what comes through for me. And it really felt like it was such a huge aha moment, because what came up today was the fact that when you are layering on top of another layer, things become so much easier because you've already learned to trust yourself. So even if you're making a bold move, even if you are adding in new colors that are a little foreign, even if you make a mistake, it doesn't feel as scary because you know that it worked out before. And it builds your trust in your intuition, because you can, at this point, say, okay, I'm just going to let this rest. And then there'll be another layer. And that other layer will bring up everything that I've learned from all of my other layers. And it's only going to make it more profound and more deep, and make me come through and trust my intuition again and again and again. And I think that's really the most incredible insight, is that layering gets you into that state of flow and trust in your intuition. And that's where we all want to be. And that is the lifelong goal, right? To fall in love with yourself and your intuition.
Yeah, I use layering a lot, and that's exactly how I accidentally discovered layering, by working on my mistakes and let that underlayer show. Because only when you let it show, even if it's in different areas, maybe not the whole painting, but in different areas, it creates depth and beauty.
Yeah, and even for those people who are listening to this and are not artsy, right, and are not painters, it speaks a lot about how we learn from our past experiences in general. So that is what I say in terms of the art experience mirroring our everyday experiences. When we are afraid of change, and when we think that we are starting from scratch, we're never really are, because we have all of these past relationships, all of these past experiences. And even though it feels scary to step into something unknown, we should be trusting our intuition so much more, because we're going to be relying on our years of living in this world, right? In terms of managing change.
Yeah, trusting the intuition to take that action, because fear stops you from taking that bold move. And in knowing, just knowing that bold move, even though it's not perfect, is taking you to that next step in your art of life.
Yeah. And the most beautiful thing that I have found is when I put people on a timer at the end of a session and I tell everybody, all right, we have 5 minutes left. That is when the most incredible things happen. Because at the end is when our brains are finally so ready to just let go and be like, you know what? I'm just going to experiment and see what happens. And all of these happy accidents happen and they make the whole experience essentially, because this is the best stuff. And it's amazing how we can kind of play with the speed that our brains work and with releasing any expectations and fears by doing that little shift.
You mentioned something earlier that kind of like clicked something into my mind. People who say they don't have a creative bone in their body. And I think we've all heard that from various people. I probably, when I was younger, had used it at certain points. But I'm always very frustrated with that sort of line of thinking, because I very much believe and have detailed on this podcast before that the main modality of humankind is artistic expression in some way. And I think there is a lot of limiting beliefs on what art is and what art isn't, and what being artful is. Was having a conversation with a friend of mine the other week that was about how essentially life choices or forming your personality, all that is actually a form of artistic expression, because you are taking experiences, things that happened, beliefs you've built, values you hold dear, and using it to build yourself, using it to transform yourself over time. That is in itself a form of artistic expression. And I'm not particularly artful in the painting way or the sketching way. Don't really have the dexterity for it, unfortunately. But I love cinema. I love photography. I love crafting images, and I love writing. Those are like those specific ways that I am able to sort of transform things from inside myself and put it onto paper or get something out of it. And I think something Chaya said about layering and kind of painting over mistakes, I think there's also kind of a reframe there that can be taken. And this is coming from me being more of like a film person. So I'll be using a little bit of film history here and maybe some other nerd stuff I can bring in for a little bit of an analogy, because I think mistake is kind of the incorrect way to view it. Now, I think certain things can happen, but they're one of my favorite movie. I love Akira Kurosawa, one of my favorite directors. And one of his films ends with, it's a fairly bloodless samurai movie for the most part, Senjuro. And the very end, there is a very short duel that takes place that the main character doesn't really want to participate in, because the violence of it is completely unnecessary. It would be resulting in a death would be completely unnecessary. And the characters face off by just kind of staring at one another, waiting to strike. And it's very quiet. And he takes one sword stroke. And what had happened while filmmaking was the device that was supposed to squirt blood show the one bit of blood in the entire film, which was to make a point, malfunctioned. And instead, what more or less took place was a geyser of blood that exploded out, which emptied the bag, which means that was the only take they could ever use anyway. So that became a pivotal moment that also kind of changed cinema, because that's where blood splatter more or less came from. You watch a Quentin Tarantino movie and someone is shot or cut and blood explodes, it's specifically because of that moment in Sanjuro, which was an accident. And it actually artistically, in the context of the film, heightened, because it's startling. It's this hit of violence and pain and just the fragility of life that hits you, that really came to get the point across of how pathetic this moment was that shouldn't have happened. And you have characters who then congratulate him for winning the duel, and he just says, what a waste, and walks off, and the film ends. It makes you think about yourself and your own views of this. And while that moment still would have been saying the same thing with the original way it was meant to be filmed, that accident brought it out in such a great way. Art will always find a way out. What you're trying to say will always kind of be enhanced, even when things get a little murky and funky. And I think that is a really great way to sort of reframe those things. The old video game industry in like the 80s and 90s, whenever there would be a glitch they'd find in the game they were working on, but it was too late to fix it before they had to ship it out, they would just write it in as a feature. So it was no longer a glitch and something wrong with it. It was just part of the game. And that's how I try to view things like that. Like it is not a mistake.
It's a feature.
Yeah, it is a feature. That's what it is. So what purpose can it serve now?
Going back to some of the Asian philosophies, when I was learning calligraphy, I came across artists who are calligraphers, and some of these Chinese and Japanese artists, they take years and years to perfect this one move, right? And it's very, very fast. And obviously through years and years of working through these, they have tons of mistakes. And what they say that just completely shifted things for me years ago is that there's no such thing as mistakes in art. It's all a matter of what you turn it into. And once again, you can see it in a such broader context than art. You can just switch and say there's no such thing as mistakes in life. It's all a matter of what you turn this into, right? So we can sit there and be victims and talk about all the different ways that we have been screwed, or we can choose to say that this is what was meant to happen for me to see a very different life and make very different decisions. And it's those choices to make different decisions that are making our lives so much more fulfilling.
Yeah, it's a lot about just accepting it and not call it a mistake. I think we are to even remove that word from the dictionary, from our own vocabulary, just fed to us by the schools, the word mistake. There are only lessons and growth. And we all should take that bold move because nobody is here to judge us. And when that move is coming from a pure place and you trust your soul to make that move, something amazing is going to happen. So I think that intention should come from a pure place. And if it's right, then it's all right.
And I think a lot of times that's another really fascinating thing that Jay Shetty and Mel Robbins were talking about is when we judge ourselves and the way that we think others see us, we don't even think about what they're truly thinking. What we're judging is what we think they think of us, right? So it's so many points removed from what they might actually be thinking because we don't know. And what they're thinking is completely irrelevant to the decisions that you should be making. But we're just so trained to be that constant observer of what's going on and how we are judged and what people are thinking of us that it just becomes so hard to make decisions with trusting yourself.
Whenever you kind of complete a piece or start working on one, or you kind of have that moment where you feel like you kind of back up, what is something that is sort of like deep within you that you feel is, even if you didn't intend it, is imparted upon the piece? Like, what is something that kind of comes out of you that's sort of is an echo of you that becomes part of it?
I think every single piece becomes successful if there is a moment in time when I could feel that little girl inside of me just playing and having a voice. And that is, for me, I think the most validating and affirming moment during the workshops that I lead as well is watching people become those little kids. And the process of making art is really that outlet to go deep within and to get in touch with our true inner self. So it's that kind of opportunity to take time and space to have a conversation with a really vulnerable part of you that wants to come out and have a voice, but is rarely given that opportunity.
I know for me, whenever I've written 8 out of 10 times, I never intend for this to end up on the page. Even if no one else notices it, I'm able to notice it when I go back to read it. usually something about depression and autonomy ends up in the story, in the piece, in even just a random stray line of dialogue. And I would never realize it at that particular time until later. It's something, whenever you create, you're always carrying something with you, always carrying a version of yourself with you. And I think there's always this thought that you're going to work it out through art, which is very true. But I also think it's very much about engaging with that part of yourself more so than working it out. I think people look at it as if they're going to rid those, if they have demons, they're going to rid the demons through art, which
knives around and, splash paint on the canvas and the buckets
exactly.
like, Jackson Pollock did. Yeah.
Yes. But I think it's really is just about, it's how we communicate with those parts of ourselves and how we are able to be a little bit kinder to those parts of ourselves and do it in a way that feels maybe constructive to us, that feels elemental in some way. And that's why I think it is so important. And things like the Spark method are so interesting, to find ways to engage, because that's all, all of these things are just different ways to engage. And as I said before, that the main, I think, language of humankind is artistic expression. That is the deepest way for us to engage in that, is through creating. It is what we do. And our own lives are forms of creativity.
I think the hardest thing for people a lot of times is putting things into words. And also the hardest thing is sitting with our emotions and not trying to fix things, not trying to deny those emotions. And that process of engaging in artistic expression lets you sit with the very unpleasant feelings sometimes and with the very vulnerable parts of yourselves. And what I'm noticing as well is that, and you're right, you're bringing in all of your different layers to the party, right? And they all come out, whether it's something joyful and full of awe and gratitude, or whether it's something painful that needed to come through. It's all a part of you as this whole holistic, right, human being. And that is the beauty of art. And I think that is why art therapy is becoming more and more recognized as one of those outlets, because you sitting down with a therapist might not be the solution to a lot of people, but having another way of expressing what's going on with you is that incredible way of processing thoughts and emotions and being vulnerable, which many of us refuse to do or have a hard time doing.
I hear the word burnout a lot, and your TED Talk was about using creativity to help with the burnout. So what happens when somebody is experiencing burnout, and how we talked about how we can use art to release it, but I wonder, what exactly is burnout? I did experience it back in school, but I moved on from that place. So if you can make that connection and share your knowledge.
Sure. Yeah. I think the state of burnout is that state of complete overwhelm, where we feel like there's so much on our plate that there's not enough time and space for us to handle it all. And it just feels like things are falling through the cracks, and more things end up on our plate, and we're not sure where to start and how to break it down and what to focus on. And the process of art, because it is so methodical in so many ways, teaches us that you don't have to be overwhelmed with the whole, that you can break things down into sections, that you don't have to be stuck in the center of a problem. You can focus on the periphery and on working things through kind of one by one, and that you can see, that we're looking at the forest for the trees and we're not appreciating what is going on kind of on a larger scale with our lives, because we're so stuck, right? It's that feeling of being stuck. And because we're stuck, we feel that the flight or fight syndrome but we're just frozen, right? Because we're not quite sure how to proceed. So it's kind of all of that compounding and us not being able to find a solution. And I know that so many people have had this in all different age groups through COVID, because it was such a big trauma to us all. But I also think it's a lot worse now, because on one hand, we have that kind of PTSD from that trauma, but we've also begun to work a lot more because now we're available 24/7, right? And now that things are shifting in the economy, people have multiple jobs that are kind of thrown at them, or things that are added onto their plate of being potentially parents and working parents, and not really finding the time to honor themselves and healing themselves before more and more things are added on. So it's real.
And I feel it's about chasing that goal, that unrealistic goal, that
perfection, and balancing it all.
Yeah, it's about balancing and realizing what is important to you. Whose goal are you running? Is it somebody else's? Was it fed to you by somebody, or did you have an unrealistic self that you had to achieve these things? So if we bring that focus back to us and question what is it that's important to you, we can remove things that are not important, that really is not ours, because we carry traumas from teachers, from bosses, from parents, other people's trauma in us. And so when we remove that, we'll realize that really what's important to me right now is just this one or two things, and nobody's judging. And if we start creating our lives from that point, which is truly ours, we'll go where we are meant to go. And so I think in this world, to step away from things that are not ours.
And that is directly connected to people pleasing and to wanting to do right by others at the expense of not doing right by us. I just shared a few days ago that I've been kind of, since the times of post-COVID, I've been keeping a journal where every night I write down 3 wins for that day, 3 gratitudes, 3 things I release, and 3 things that are valuable in me because of what I believe in. And I've been doing this for 3 years now. And what came to me the other day is to put it all together and ask AI to analyze it for any transformations that occurred and any progress that has been established. And the number one thing that came up for me is that over the years, partially through this process of just journaling and being very intentional about focusing on the wins rather than the self-criticism and, on the 1,000 things that I don't get to do every day, right? Or finish every day, but really on the wins and the gratitudes for things that I have every day. But what has happened over time, over the course of this past year, is that I've moved from seeking external validation and always thinking about, well, if I post this, what are these people going to think, right? If I write this, how am I going to be judged? To internal validation and just knowing that I am who I am and I'm standing in my own truth. And if there are people who are ready to hear what I have to say, that's amazing. And it'll be so affirming to recognize that in some way, maybe I shifted somebody's mindset. But if I don't, that's totally fine. As long as I am living truthfully with who I am and what I'm bringing to this world. And that was just such a balm for my heart, in terms of that growth and what you mentioned, Chaya, in terms of us learning to love ourselves, which is the ultimate goal, right?
Which is the ultimate goal. And from that love, if we can help others, we've achieved our purpose.
Yeah.
One thing that you talked about Spark can help with are people going through life transitions. What are some different transitions that you define that as?
When I was crafting my TED Talk, I thought about my personal 3 stages in life where that all of us face and that I think all of us can put ourselves into that definitely resonated with people. The first was being bullied in school. And that's sort of how I came to art in the first place. And then being very vulnerable when I was a fresh graduate from college, looking for direction and looking for what am I to do in this world, right? And then the third, when I was in my 30s and on the surface, a very successful executive, but deep inside, stressed out and anxious and having miscarriages due to stress. And as a woman, I think every woman can relate to all of these things that happen due to stress and to perfectionism and to those ridiculous goals that we set for ourselves. And it doesn't, I don't mean to exclude you, Mike. I think that is the case for men and women alike. But I've just seen it in so many different people. I've seen people recover from loss through the use of art. I've seen people move on to a completely different career path because of art. It is that opportunity to look deep within to who you truly are that this outlet offers you. And if you listen and are courageous enough to follow what your intuition is telling you, then your life changes for the better.
I think we all should find some form of art, even journaling is art, to connect to ourselves on a daily basis, because we're constantly growing and changing and evolving. And the more we do it and do it as part of our daily ritual, we can transition faster into our true calling.
For sure. And for me, it was interesting, Mike, that you mentioned that you do a lot of writing. I have discovered that my best writing happens as I am painting. So what I have started doing in the course of really just last year or two is always having a notepad next to me. And as I'm painting and having these insights come through, it's almost like I'm channeling all this new information that needs to come out in words as well. And constantly getting comments from people who are professional authors about how beautiful and insightful and profound the messages are. And the same thing happened to me during the TED Talk. It really felt like I wasn't the one on that stage, that I was simply channeling a message that needed to come through. And the messages that are coming through for me when I'm painting are exactly that. Those thoughts that hopefully somebody will hear and they will resonate and change something in their wiring and get them to accept themselves for the creative people that they are.
It's also a wonderful way, I think, to reach back kind of through time and interact with past versions of yourself, looking at a piece you wrote or painted, and you're right back there to that place, to that version of yourself that created that. And it kind of is able to hold that version in amber in a lot of ways. And that goes back, of course, to many things are artful and can be art. For instance, if someone's going through grief and they lost their mother or something, and they then want to cook a meal that their mother always cooked, and that is able to connect them and that's able to soothe them. That is the same type of artful practice. And then suddenly cooking that meal is that version of you frozen in amber, who's both able to be back to that more innocent place, but also connect with the person that got through the grief simultaneously. And I think that's such a beautiful way that art can be used.
Definitely. Yeah.
So how can our audience seek you out and seek Spark out and connect with you?
Yeah, I think the easiest way is my website, dianastelin.com. They can reach out through emailing me from there. And I have lots of different presentation materials should somebody be interested in a potential corporate workshop, or if they're local to Boston, they're welcome to come in for a class or a retreat and bring their team in if they're interested. And yeah, I would love to hear people's thoughts and maybe insights and things that they can share about art making in various forms, whether it's actual painting or drawing or photography or cinematography or baking or whatever ways their creativity shows through for them and what it does for them.
Wonderful. And if you're interested listening at home to learn more, all those links will, of course, be in the show notes for this episode found at sparklaunchpodcast.com. Diana, work you do is fascinating, and I love this kind of stuff. So the more this is able to overtake some other practices in many ways, I think is the best way for people to connect with themselves and to connect with others as well. So I want to thank you for the work you do.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Diana. What you've done with your work and this space you've created for others is a temple for healing. So thank you for that.
Yeah. And I just wanted to leave you with, a few weeks ago, I did one of these critiques for my class where it was their last session and we're all standing there. And this one woman is saying how she hates the painting that she came up with. It was not at all what she intended to create. And meanwhile, the rest of us are standing there. The painting is stunning, absolutely stunning. And we're all looking at it, thinking and saying to her, but this is gorgeous. Maybe this isn't what you intended, but it came out in such a beautiful way. And she's just not able to hear it. But then I have this other student from the class come up to me and she says, this was such a great lesson because I realized that this is what I do to myself all the time. I think that I am doing such a horrible job at whatever I'm doing, and that people are going to think that this is atrocious and not worth it. Meanwhile, I don't recognize that people think much higher of it than I ever will, right? And that people actually appreciate and love the work that I do, whereas I am being so overly critical. And it was such a great lesson in lessening that nagging voice of the critic, right? The inner critic that we all have.
I want to add to one more thing to this is our creation is not meant for everybody. So if somebody rejects our work that we love, it's okay. It's okay because we don't know who we are creating for. So just trust the universe and it will go where it's meant to go. Maybe it's just for us to evolve.
This episode was brought to you by Sparkade, our ADHD game-based learning platform designed to spark focus, confidence, and joy through play. Join the waitlist today at play.sparkade.app/waitlist. That's play.sparkade.app.